Rome didn't build an empire on courage alone, it built it on debt. We like to imagine the Roman legions as unstoppable warriors fueled by honor and discipline. But behind every polished helmet and sharpened gladius was a supply chain of staggering complexity and cost. Thousands of men needed food, weapons, roads, and pay. Horses needed feed. Siege weapons needed timber and labor, and all of it required money. A lot of it. So how did Rome finance centuries of conquest? And why does it still matter today? Because the deeper you look into the Roman war machine, the clearer the pattern becomes. War wasn't just fought on the battlefield, it was baked into the financial system itself. And once that system was in motion, it couldn't stop. Expansion wasn't a choice, it was an economic necessity. Sound familiar? Let's go back. In the early Republic, Rome's military was a citizen army. If you owned land, you could be drafted. Soldiers brought their own weapons and expected to return to their farms after the campaign. But as the Republic expanded, wars became longer and further from home. The old model started breaking down. You couldn't just grab a spear and head off for a year anymore. You needed professional soldiers. That's when Rome began to centralize military financing. The state started paying stipends to its soldiers. Not much, but enough to keep them loyal. Then came the real pivot. Conquest itself became a revenue model. Every new province meant new taxes, new slaves, new gold mines, and new tribute. It was a self-reinforcing loop. War funded more war. But here's where it gets interesting and dangerous. Rome didn't just rely on taxation, it relied heavily on borrowing. During long or expensive wars, like the Punic Wars against Carthage, the Republic took out massive public loans from the wealthy elite, particularly the equites, Rome's rising financial class. These weren't patriotic donations, they were investments, and those investors expected returns in the form of interest payments, tax farming rights, and business monopolies in the newly conquered territories. So war became a business, and the more profitable it was, the more wars Rome started. Sound familiar? Over time, this militarized economy reshaped everything. Political power tilted toward generals who could promise spoils. Senators became shareholders in violence. Private contractors, the publicani, managed everything from logistics to tax collection, skimming fortunes off the top. It was military-industrial capitalism in a toga. And the costs? They piled up. To pay soldiers and creditors, the state had to find new revenue constantly. When conquests slowed or uprisings drained the treasury, Rome resorted to the oldest trick in the book, debasing the currency. Starting under Emperor Nero, the silver content in the denarius was quietly reduced. Over the next 2 centuries, emperors kept diluting it, turning what was once a reliable silver coin into a thin promise backed by nothing. Inflation followed, confidence eroded. By the 3rd century, Rome's monetary system was in free fall. Meanwhile, the rich got richer. Senators and equites shielded their wealth in land, slaves, and foreign accounts. The poor paid taxes in debased currency, while the elite secured tax exemptions and insider deals. Public service collapsed, corruption soared, and the financial burden of endless wars fell squarely on the lower classes, through inflation, labor levies, and military conscription. This wasn't just a military collapse, it was a monetary one. Now pause and look around today. Governments running massive deficits, wars funded through borrowing, central banks quietly debasing currency to cover the shortfall, a financial class getting rich from defense contracts and crisis profiteering, an economy where expansion, military, monetary, or market-based, is the only way to keep the system afloat. It's not a perfect parallel, of course, but the DNA is disturbingly familiar. What Rome teaches us is that an economy built on expansion, especially violent expansion, eventually hits a wall. You run out of lands to conquer, resources to extract, or enemies to fight. And when that happens, the entire system turns inward. The debt remains. The expectations remain. But the revenue dries up. That's when the state starts squeezing its own people. Rome turned to heavier taxation, more currency debasement, more control. Bread and circuses to keep the masses quiet, while the elite fortified their villas. Sound familiar? Today, we don't call it tribute. We call it taxation, quantitative easing, or monetary policy. But the mechanics are eerily similar. Central banks print money, governments spend more than they earn, the rich buy assets, the poor buy groceries with shrinking paychecks. Wars are still financed through borrowing. The U.S. spent over $2 trillion on the war in Afghanistan, most of it funded by debt. Who gets the contracts? Who earns the interest? Who ends up footing the bill through inflation, reduced services, and unstable currencies? You already know the answer, and like in Rome, the cycle feeds itself. Once debt becomes your default, you don't need an emergency to print money. You just need to avoid collapse. You normalize the exceptional, and the longer it goes on, the more you have to pretend it's fine, until it's not. That's what makes economic history so important. These aren't just dusty stories, they're warning signs. And when we look at Rome, we see a state that outsourced too much power to private finance, became addicted to expansion, hollowed out its currency, and crushed its own citizens under the weight of unsustainable obligations. Not because it was evil, but because the system had no off switch. Today, we're living in a different empire, digital, global, and powered by capital flows instead of legions. But the game is still the same. Money and power move together. War is still profitable. Inflation still punishes the weak, and financial illusions still work until they don't. So what can you do? Start by seeing the pattern. Because most people don't. Most people think inflation is random, that taxes are just necessary, that debt is freedom, that growth can go on forever. But the Stoics had a word for that: delusion. You can't opt out of the system entirely, but you can understand it. You can stop playing the game blindly. You can build your own resilience, not just with money, but with mindset. That means studying financial history, not just personal finance. That means watching for signs of systemic stress, not just market hype. That means asking, who profits when I stay confused? Because you weren't supposed to know this. You weren't supposed to ask how Rome paid for its wars, or how the modern state does it now. You were supposed to focus on the theater, the headlines, the GDP, the distractions. Not the mechanisms, not the incentives. But now you know, and once you know, you can't unsee it. Financial education isn't just about budgets and investing. It's about understanding power, understanding systems, and seeing through the illusion of stability. So next time you hear about a new conflict, a new stimulus, a new crisis, don't just watch. Follow the money. Ask who lends, who earns, and who pays in the end. Because if history teaches us anything, it's this: empires don't fall when the enemy breaches the gate. They fall when the math stops working, and no one dares to fix it. If this gave you a new perspective, hit subscribe. History has the answers. I'll show you where to look.